Hello, and welcome to Threads of Fate, a podcast all about astrology, divination, and the threads of fate that weave throughout all of our lives. My name is Kira Ryberg. I'm your host, and today we are going to be diving into the astrology of October. I'm very happy to tell you that this month is a lot chiller than the past two. August and September were a bit of a doozy. We had eclipses, we had a Mars Saturn opposition. It was tough times all the way around with a few bright spots. And October has a little bit more to offer us in way of support, but it does take a minute before we get there. So let's talk about every alignment, the most important ones, at least, that we're going to experience this month, so you can feel ready and prepared for the month ahead. Now, the month does start off on a little bit of a harsher note because on October 4th, Venus is going to conjoin the South Node in Virgo. Now, this isn't necessarily going to be a transit that is a major boom, kind of in your face sort of event, but it does mean that on October 4th and in the days leading up, Venus is going to be increasingly depreciated. She is going to be losing her energy, losing her power, because the South Node is a kind of a reductionary force. It likes to cleanse, it likes to purify, and it likes to reduce. And so whenever a planet gets close to the South Node, we tend to see this kind of thing happening where whatever they signify starts to become a little bit less accessible for us. And with Venus, the planet of love and beauty and fun and delay and creativity, it can feel like those things are absent from our experience for a given amount of time. Venus is already in a sign that she doesn't really love to be in, which is Virgo, because she finds her fall here, which essentially means this is one of the hardest signs for Venus to be in. So when you combine all of those factors, it does kind of spell a little bit more difficulty for love, for relationships, for creativity, and for just embracing a little bit more of a pleasure-filled perspective, at least up until the middle of the month. So be prepared for October 4th to bring potential insights around relationships, but probably more through a loss rather than a gain. It can feel like a letting go of certain things, of Venusian principles in your life. And Venus does tend to represent our values. The more positive expression of this transit can be clarity around what you do value, what you do want to commit to, what does bring you that source of joy, but it's often through recognizing that it's not present currently. So just kind of take care of yourself. If it feels like people are a little bit further away or you're a little bit less energized, this is why. And it's because Venus is not only just responsible for herself, but she is also ruling the sun right now, which is a planet of vitality, right? Because the sun is in Venus's sign of Libra. So this can feel like a little bit of a drain on our energy and a little bit of a drain on our vitality. This is going to be a lot more prominent for people who have placements around 18 degrees of Virgo, where this conjunction occurs, but it is also going to show up for anybody who is in a Libra or Taurus perfection year, or who is a Libra or Taurus rising in their own chart, because Venus is a major player in your year or in your life as the planet that is kind of calling the shots for you. So take care. You know, it's not the easiest one, but we're going to get through it as we do with any other difficult transit. And on October 6th, we are going to have a change of pace as Mercury leaves Libra and enters into Scorpio. Now, this can actually be kind of nice because the thing about Mercury being in Libra is that it's ruled by that Venus who's conjunct the South Node. So Mercury is also taking a hit from Venus not necessarily feeling as supported and resourced. Now, when Mercury enters Scorpio, on the other hand, he starts hanging out with Mars. Mars is at home in Scorpio. Mars is extremely happy to be there. It's been a while since Mars has been home, right? And it means that Mercury is going to start taking on a little bit more of a malefic kind of nature. Now, when we tend to think of Mercury, we kind of think of them as being like a chill guy, right? Like we don't really think of Mercury as malefic. But if you read ancient astrological texts or you explore the meaning of Mercury, it's that they're both and, right? They do both things. They wear both faces. They can be benefic or they can be malefic. And they're kind of like a chameleon in the sense that they take on the qualities of whoever they're hanging out with. And so it's kind of like a friend who is easily peer pressured, right? Mercury is happy to raise havoc and raise hell with the malefics Mars and Saturn, and is very happy to be happy and joyous and pleasant when with Venus and Jupiter. So when Mercury does move into the sign of Scorpio and starts getting closer and closer to Mars, we're going to experience a bit more of that mischievous, trickster, malefic face of Mercury. This isn't always a bad thing, but it can be a little uncomfortable, especially coming out of Mercury and Libra, where we are a lot more oriented towards social grace and ease and harmony and compromise. Mercury in Scorpio does not compromise. Mercury in Scorpio is decisive. Mercury in Scorpio has their mind made up about how things should go and is going to kind of say it like it is a lot more than they're going to in Libra. So this can create a little bit more of a direct kind of confrontational style of communication. But Scorpio is not Aries, right? This is Mars's nocturnal domicile. So even though Mercury is going to be there, Scorpio tends to have a little bit more of a secretive, plotting kind of energy to it. Mercury in Scorpio is that friend who has all the receipts, but only pulls them out at the exact moment that they need to prove their point, to take down an enemy, right? To defend themselves or to protect someone. So there can be a little bit more of a calculating nature with Mercury and Scorpio, especially as they get closer and closer to Mars. I always think of Mercury Mars context as like the rap battle placement, which I think I got from Chris Brennan. And it's so true. It is people who have this kind of quick wit, right? Mars brings the heat and the fire and the energy, and Mercury is going to incline you to be a little bit more focused on communication, on thoughts, ideas, and the transmission of information. And so when you combine those two, you get people who are really sharp-minded, who are really quick-witted, but also have a very direct style of communication that can sometimes poke a little bit more. Mercury in Scorpio is happy to make people uncomfortable with their opinions. And that is going to be the nature of what we are all experiencing as Mercury moves through this sign for the next little while. Mercury in Scorpio is also very kind of interested in investigating things, likes to dig deeper into different subjects and fields of interest, right? Mercury in Scorpio goes deep, it doesn't go wide. And so you might find yourself just getting absolutely fascinated or enraptured with a certain topic or subject during this transit that you feel like you just want to keep going deeper and deeper and deeper with. It's kind of like this energy of how far can I take this though? And it has this almost investigator quality. And when Mercury enters into Scorpio, it's going to square Pluto, which is really going to ignite that. And so when that square occurs, right, which is going to be the first day or two of this transit, October 6th, October 7th, there can be the revelation of secrets, of hidden things, right, of power dynamics and having conversations about those. Squares aren't always bad, which is a really important thing to remember. Squares can be catalysts for action, right? So a Mercury Pluto square can help you take action to have conversations around power dynamics, around things that feel unfair, around secrets and things that have been kind of hidden underneath the surface for a while. And so you can expect a little bit more of kind of an explosive communicative quality to really be carrying us through those first few days of that transit. Now, Mercury is going to come back to Scorpio. So keep in mind as Mercury gets further and further along in this transit that Mercury is going to station retrograde in the early degrees of Sagittarius and then retrograde back into Scorpio, station direct around, I think, 21 degrees. And so we're going to be doing Mercury in Scorpio for a while, and so the things that you say, the secrets that are revealed, the conversations that you have, the subjects that pull you in, they are not going anywhere. They are going to be revisited. And so think about how you want to communicate. Think about when the best plan of attack is actually, when the best time for that is, rather than maybe being a little bit more explosive as Mercury and Mars can be when they conjoin, right? Which occurs a little bit more towards the middle of the month. They're going to conjoin around 18 degrees of Scorpio, which can be a major moment for people who have fixed sign placements around 18 degrees that get activated by that conjunction. So just kind of keep that in mind that we're not done with Mercury and Scorpio. Mercury doesn't fly through Scorpio, and then we kind of forget about it, right? So Mercury conjoins Mars at 19 degrees, but they'll both be occupying 18 degrees together on October 20th, right? And that's right around the degree that Mercury begins its shadow period. So it's almost like something explodes, right? We become a lot more aware of how we want to communicate with people. This can be an aspect that is a little bit more divisive, a little bit more conflict oriented. And, the best case scenario is that this is generative conflict. It's about having hard conversations, telling hard truths, doing so in a direct manner, revealing your feelings about something, and then having an opportunity to repair that. But the repair might come later because we do see Mercury coming back to hang out right around this degree later on in the year. Just be ready for that. Now, on October 7th, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys so we can talk about this full moon that we're having in Aries, right? There's a lot of Mars energy this month as you're going to notice as Mars in Scorpio, right? But now we also have this full moon in Aries and Libra. And with this full moon, there's something kind of nice, dare I say, about it, because we have been doing eclipses in Aries and Libra for a very long time, it feels like. And this is the first lunation that is not an eclipse, I believe, that's occurring in Aries. And so it should kind of feel like something is coming to a climax point on this axis in your chart, but not in a way that is as disruptive as we were seeing when we were having eclipses in Aries and Libra last year. So we can kind of rejoice that this is a little bit calmer. Now, the moon is going to be ruled by a domiciled Mars down here in Scorpio, but Mars is averse to the moon, which can make it feel a little bit more complicated, right? The sun is in Libra and she is averse to Venus in Virgo, which can also make it feel like neither of these planets has the ability to actually get the resources they need during this time of heightened tension. They actually both have to kind of talk to Jupiter because Jupiter can see Venus, Jupiter can see Mars. So Jupiter is really the planet that brings this whole lunation together, which I think is a bit of a nice thing, honestly, because Jupiter is extremely dignified in Cancer. They are in their sign of exaltation. They are in their own bound. They are in a decan that they co-rule. And this part of the zodiac that Jupiter is occupying, this decan, is one that is associated with abundance, can be associated with a feeling of being almost too full, having too much of something, right? And sometimes that's a nice place to be in. Like having more than enough is usually a feeling that we tend to feel is more comfortable than having too little of something. And Jupiter, too much Jupiter is like too much optimism, too much hope, too much beneficence, right? There are worse things to have than that, especially in the times that we are living in. So I think Jupiter's presence in this lunation, especially with the moon ruling Jupiter and applying to Jupiter, is actually support. Although the planets being averse is confusing at times, and you might not necessarily know immediately what this eclipse is all about for you. It might take a little bit before you can kind of integrate and understand what comes up around this time and really feel like, oh, that's what that full moon was about for me. Sometimes we look at the day that a transit occurs and we're like, it doesn't seem like anything big happened. And sometimes that's because of our individual charts and the layout of them. Maybe you have no planets in Aries and Libra. Maybe you have no planets in cardinal signs at all. So this one just isn't that important for you. But maybe you do, right? And you're still like, I don't know what that's about for me. Think about it, let it kind of play out over the course of the next few days as the moon moves on to then talk to Mars when she gets into Taurus, right? That's going to help bridge the gap that we see from these aversions. Honestly, like I kind of think this full moon is boring and I'll take it. I'll take it after eclipse season. Ultimately, this is going to bring things to a heightened point of tension in your Aries and Libra parts of your chart, right? So think about what houses those occupy for you, and you can kind of expect to see some things coming full circle in that area of life. Now, the decan that the moon is occupying is one that is very associated with a need for privacy and also demand of visibility. So you might find yourself reckoning with those themes at this time, especially with the sun being in a sign that she does not necessarily like to be in, right? The sun is in fall in Libra, just like Venus is in fall in Virgo. So having this opposition here, highlighting this tension between light and dark, privacy and publicity, right, can be a big theme that shows up. How much are you giving to other people? How much are you keeping for you? Can be one of the ways that we really see this dynamic play out. On top of the fact that Aries and Libra is just an axis that deals with the we and the me, right? The moon in Aries is a little bit more concerned with what's best for me, though. How is this helping me on my path? How is this helping me accomplish my goals? It's very ambitious. Whereas the sun in Libra is like, but what about compromise, right? What about everybody else? What about all of the social harmony that we need to maintain, that can't always necessarily be navigated when you have a focus that is a little bit more self-leaning. So you might feel a clash between your desire to go after the things that feel really important for you, and then the call to also consider another person's perspective, to compromise a little bit. You might even feel pings of that Mars-Saturn opposition that we experienced earlier in the year in August, that took place on the Aries and Libra axis, right? We are now doing another opposition there that is bringing us back into this story that kind of erupted during that time. So you can expect to see, a little bit of a ping on that, and consider what was going on for you during that time. Now, this decan of Aries that the moon is moving through is very concerned with what worlds, are being built by the virtue of your own effort, right? So it's like having this grand vision and wanting to accomplish it. And the moon is very concerned with that here. And so you might be called to really think about, what are you creating? And are you proud of that? Are you being consistent in your efforts in a way that you can look back on and say, this is getting me closer to my goals? Right? That is a big part of the story of this decan. Whereas the sun is in the middle decan of Libra, which is all about commitments. It's a double Saturn ruled decan. And it asks you, what are you binding yourself to? Right? So this can feel like, well, have you committed to the thing that you want to create, even when it's hard, and even when you feel under resourced, and even when you feel tired, And this is going to be a story in Aries that really continues for a couple of years once Saturn re-enters Aries on February 13th, right? We're getting a little bit of a break from that. Neptune is also going to go back into Pisces this month. So there's going to be some pressure taken off of that part of our charts. But at the same time, this feels like one last big flash of awareness from the cosmos, trying to pull our attention there and really ask, what needs to change, what needs to solidify, what needs to be committed to, so that when Neptune and Saturn re-enter this sign, we can really make the progress that we need to make here to create long-lasting results and a solid foundation that is going to be something that we can rely on for not just years to come, but decades to come. So that is kind of the nature of this full moon, which is happening at, again, 14 degrees of Aries. So anybody with placements around 14 degrees of cardinal signs, which really like 11 to 17, you are going to be the people who are feeling this the most, on top of anyone who is in an Aries or Libra perfection year. So that's the full moon this month. Like I said, we can always dig into the story there, but on the surface, it seems chiller than most. And I think it's going to feel like a nice break from the eclipse energy where those lunations were so supercharged. I don't know about you guys. I don't know if it's just because I have a mutable rising sign, and Virgo and Pisces are my 10th house, but these eclipses have taken me for a ride. I feel like they were so loud this time around, and it tends to feel that way a lot of the time, but this time in particular, that south node solar eclipse in Virgo was so draining, so exhausting. And I think it's going to be nice to have a lunation that doesn't necessarily feel as bad as those eclipses did. So moving on to October 11th, we have a Venus-Saturn opposition. This is the last little kind of spot of difficulty that Venus has to get through before we get some of the really beautiful things that Venus has to offer us later in the month. Now, Venus Saturn oppositions, it brings together these principles of the Venusian and the Saturnian and puts them in conflict with one another, right? Saturn likes to say no to things. Venus likes to say yes to things. Venus wants us to focus on, like we talked about before, relationships and love and our desires and what brings us that sense of pleasure and joy and beauty and happiness in our lives. She's already struggling in Virgo. She's approaching her maximum degree of fall. She is getting to a point in the zodiac where she is quite literally the most powerless that she can possibly feel, which is hard for her and hard for us, right? Because we need Venus, and we kind of live in a debilitated Venus society in a lot of ways where we don't place as much emphasis on the true Venusian values. And instead, we get caught up in almost like a fallen Venus, like ideal of tweaking and perfecting beauty rather than appreciating all forms of beauty, right? All forms of creativity, all forms of relationships. And instead, we try to put it in a box. And, I think Venus in her, fullest expression challenges our notions of beauty and what is socially desirable. And I think that this opposition with Saturn kind of brings all of that to a head in a way that can feel really uncomfortable for us. But like I said, right after this, Venus is going to enter into Libra, which is her home sign. And that is going to be a true moment of respite and one that we will all greatly, greatly benefit from, especially after kind of going through this Venus Saturn opposition. But because Saturn likes to say no to what Venus is trying to do, and Venus isn't very powerful in this part of Virgo, she doesn't have a lot of an ability to fight back against what Saturn is saying no to. And so this can look like rejections taking place, especially as it relates to romance and sex and friendship. Like this can be something as, mundane as asking a friend to hang out and they're like, no, I don't really feel like it. And it just hurts a little bit. You're like, oh, well, I felt like it. I wanted to hang out. I wanted to connect, and having that connection be denied, right? That's going to be like asking someone out on a date and they say no. And then you start, you're just feeling bad about yourself a little bit. This can be like wanting to start a creative project or presenting a really interesting idea to your boss. And they're like, no, we don't have time for that. We're not interested in that. We're not as focused on the aesthetics right now. We don't really care about your creativity or your desire to make this more enjoyable. Just go get done what needs to get done. That's Saturn, right? Saturn is going to bring this weight of expectation into things. It is going to bring a pressure into things. It is going to bring a little bit of this more melancholic disposition into our Venusian affairs. So you can just kind of expect for this to be a time that is a little bit more relationally challenging. It's almost just like getting a cold shower, right? Where it's like you wanted this really nice, peaceful, relaxing moment. And then all of the hot water is out. And instead you get in, you're like, I just want to get out of here. This feels so uncomfortable. It can kind of jolt you awake, which can be helpful if you're in a certain dynamic or certain relationship that you need to let go of for whatever reason, or that isn't as good for you as we might hope that it is. And Venus Saturn oppositions can also pull up that tension and say, okay, well, if this doesn't feel good, then maybe it's time to let it go. Saturn can bring things to an end. Saturn can bring things to a close. And we can see that show up a lot of times with Venus Saturn oppositions. Of course, as always, you're going to want to consider what axis Virgo and Pisces occupies in your chart to get a little bit more understanding and nuance around how this might show up for you, right? Like if it's in the 5th and the 11th house axis, it might be the friend stuff. If it's on the 4th, 10th axis, it might be the boss stuff, right? Or wanting to redecorate your home and Saturn being like, I'm too busy at work. Like, I don't have time to, make my living environment look nicer right now. If it's on the third, ninth house axis, this might show up in a desire to, beautify your routines or your everyday environment, right? And having Saturn in the ninth house being like, we've got a course to take. We don't have time to invest in beautifying the everyday and enjoying the mundane moments of taking a walk around the neighborhood, right? If it's in the second and eighth house axis, it might be more of a denial to want to spend money, want to treat yourself, want to enjoy something. And Saturn's like, actually, we need to be saving. Like, we can't really be doing that, or we don't really have the money for this. So no, you don't get to have the little treat that you want to have, right? If it's in the 6/12 axis, this can look like maybe wanting to take some time off of work to enjoy and to kind of reset. And Saturn saying, no, we can't do that, right? Which could then in turn have an impact on your mental health or something of that nature. For seventh house axis, it's going to show probably more in the standard relational context, right? Of like you and another person, you kind of reaching out for connection and commitment, and another person potentially saying no and rejecting that. It's kind of making me think of, I don't know if you guys ever saw that thing of those bid for affections or those bid for connections, right? And you ask your partner to peel an orange for you just to see if they'll do it, right? Just to see if they'll kind of take the bid for affection and give you what you need in that moment, even if it's something silly or something that you could do for yourself. Like, this feels like asking your partner to peel the orange for you and then saying no. And even though it might not be that serious, it like tells you something about the greater context of your relationship, right? That's kind of what this feels like for me. And so, this is going to be a little bit harder on people who are in Venus perfection years. People who are in Saturn ruled perfection years, this might be a little bit more significant for you as well. So just kind of keep in mind that this is the kind of last thing that we have to get through before the month starts feeling a little bit easier. But take care of yourself around this time. It's a little bit tender. Certain things are coming to a close, certain things are coming to an end. I know for myself, this is going to be happening on my fourth, 10th house axis, and I'm going to be moving in 2 days, right? So I'm literally getting rid of everything in my home and also preparing to do a big 10th house thing. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on that axis in my chart. And so you can also just anticipate, a little bit of pressure, a little bit of mounting stress. Oppositions can feel like you're being swung from one side of the chart to the other, and those planets are kind of duking it out. But in this context, Saturn is probably going to win just because Venus doesn't have as many resources as we might like to see her be able to fight back. But the one kind of saving grace with this is that Saturn is in Venus's exaltation. So Saturn is kind of, a little bit kinder to Venus, right? Where this might be a chosen ending, this might be a rejection that opens another door for you in the future. And there might be a little bit of softening because of that, but that's kind of the best that I can offer in terms of this feeling maybe not as gnarly as it probably is going to feel, because Venus Saturn stuff, harsh Venus Saturn contacts and squares and oppositions and sometimes conjunctions, depending on the sign, just usually not as easy, to experience. So hang in there, hang tight, because on October 13th, Venus enters Libra, and this is going to feel qualitatively very, very different, right? Not only is Venus away from Saturn, she's also out of the sign of her fall, and she's away from the South Node. So all of these things that have been putting such a damper on the Libra and Taurus parts of our chart are now going to have a weight, literally the Saturnian weight, lifted off of her shoulders. The thing that was completely sucking her drive energy, gone, right? And she is now going from a place of having no resources, right? Being depressed, exiled, fallen, to a place of being in domicile, right? In her own home, ability to make her own rules and to do her thing and to express as much as she wants to, so it's going to feel really nice. It's like the queen comes home, and we should enjoy it, because for the next couple of years, Saturn's going to be in Aries. So every time that we get Venus in Libra up until 2028, we're going to be doing a Venus Saturn opposition. We just talked about what that means. It's not the nicest, right? It'll be a little bit easier because, there's going to be some, Venus will be in Saturn side of exaltation, right? There's a little bit of reception there, but at the same time, it's still going to feel kind of like a damper on that transit for the next few years. So this time around, we got to make the most of it. We got to enjoy, right? Bask in frivolity, be creative, go on dates with yourself, with your friends, with your lovers, right? And enjoy this moment of having Venus be a little bit more present and able to express her influence in your life, right? Venus is that creative force, and this can look like doing Legos. This can look like drawing or painting. This can look like going to a wine night where you do some arts and crafts, right? This can also look like going shopping with friends, getting a little treat, getting a massage, calling up someone you haven't spoken to in a while and reconnecting, fighting for social justice because Libra is ultimately a sign of justice, connecting back with that part of yourself in a way that is really profound. And I think that this Venus and Libra transit is one that I'm really, really looking forward to. And it's not like I don't have a night chart, Libra doesn't do anything crazy in my chart, but it's definitely going to be one that is a little bit nicer, you know? Now, when Venus enters into Libra, she's also going to aspect a lot of these outer planets, right? She's going to trine Pluto in Aquarius. And there's going to be these aspects that she's making with these planets who are going through a lot of shifts. Uranus station retrograde in Gemini. She's going to be trining Uranus, trining Pluto, and she is also going to be, well, Neptune enters, or we get a, Venus, Neptune opposition, which is probably the harder one on the 14th, but there are supportive aspects to Pluto and to Uranus. And all of those planets are in the midst of creating a new world, right? And having Venus aspect them, I think, is going to bring a little bit more beauty into that idea of what are we creating and what world are we stepping into? And I hope some justice. The one thing to be a little bit mindful of that I just mentioned is on the 14th, we're doing a Venus Neptune opposition. And Neptune, I often describe as a fog, right? It's more of like a force than a character, if you want to kind of use that orientation towards the planets. The traditional 7 planets versus the 3 outer planets. And so with that, it can feel like Venus is hitting a wall of fog right when she moves into Libra. And that can confuse her. It can distort her ideas of beauty and pleasure and enjoyment. It can sometimes be her taking it a little too far because she doesn't have the same orientation around limits because Neptune is dissolving boundaries and she is running up against that, right? But Neptune also tends to present as rose-colored glasses a lot of the time. And so this can feel like, running into a conflict with seeing things in a certain light and then realizing later on that, oh, actually, that's not exactly how things, are going to pan out. So there's a little bit of like a Delulu energy with this Venus-Neptune opposition that can make you feel a bit confused about relationships, creativity, pleasure, desires, right? Where it's like, what do I want even is a Venus Neptune opposition question, right? And so if you don't have that clarity right away, that's okay. It might feel like, well, Venus entered Libra, but what's going on here? Like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do or how to kind of allow this energy into my sphere in a way that feels really good. This too shall pass, she's moving through the fog. And then after she gets past that opposition, which is immediate, right? Like she enters really, really late on the 13th, almost on the 14th, depending on your time zone, hits that Neptune opposition right away. And then she clears it. And it's like, I always think of planets separating from Neptune as like coming out of this foggy forest, right? Where there's kind of still like in energy there. The fog is dissipating, but still there, right? So with every passing hour, day, Venus gets further and further away from the fog, and clarity is going to emerge as a result. But yeah, this is going to be a really nice time. It's also going to help the sun out quite a bit because now Venus is not going to be averse in fall opposing Saturn, conjunct the South Node, right? But is going to be able to give the sun a lot more resources and a lot more support. So any Leo risings in the chat, any people in a Leo perfection year, this should also bring a welcome boost and is going to reorient our perspectives towards Libran principles, which are a little bit more self-sacrificing, a little bit more doing it for the good of the group, right? A little bit more inclined towards justice, like we were talking about before, and also what is beautiful, what is harmonious, what feels good, right? What is delightful and enjoyable. So, like I said, I'm really looking forward to this transit. I think we could all use a little bit more Venus in our lives. And since Venus is going to be in Libra, Jupiter's going to be in Cancer. We're getting some dignified benefics for the first time in a while. Venus has been hurting. She does okay in Cancer, right? When we had that Venus Jupiter conjunction, but we also had the Mars Saturn opposition at the same time. So this is going to be a little bit of a sweet spot where things start feeling really good. I know for elections, there's kind of like some nice moments that happen after Venus moves into Libra too. So if you need to start anything, right, mid-October onwards is a little bit more supportive of that. Now, on October 14th, Pluto is also going to station direct. So, this is the same day as the Venus Neptune opposition. And this is really going to bring a focus on some of the themes we've been seeing from this transit overall over the past year or two, right? Which are usually very connected to advancements in tech, AI, the age of air stuff, right? It's like all of this kind of focus that we are moving away from this age of earth where everything is really focused on materiality, on what is tangible, on kind of a couple people being at the top, towards a little bit more of an Aquarian disposition, right? We had that Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, which kicked off this age of air that is a lot more oriented towards flexibility, on communication, on information. And we can see the ways that Pluto in Aquarius has amplified that storyline, right? Has kind of brought massive advancements. Like you think about where we were with AI a year and a half ago and where we are now, and it's terrifying in a lot of ways, but it's also this kind of like speed of light sort of thing, right? That we saw when, the internet first came out. And so this is going to be, I would look in the news for stuff about AI, stuff about tech, right? And seeing some of those things that have been emerging as a result of this transit kicking off. Now, if you have placements around early degrees of fixed signs, this can also be a turning point in that Pluto narrative, which tends to honestly feel pretty uncomfortable at first. Pluto transits are long. It's not like every single day you're doing the Phoenix rising from the ashes transformation thing that we ascribe to Pluto, right? But it can feel almost like this like a watchdog on your shoulder, kind of like grinding you to really focus deep and rebuild things. And it doesn't always feel super easy. Pluto exposes, but Pluto is also kind of like the hurricane that comes in and tears everything up before you rebuild, very similar to Saturn in that way, right? But because Pluto transits take so long, it can feel like there's a lot of upheaval that happens in that process. If you have planets at early degrees of fixed signs or lots or your ascendant, it's going to feel like there is an intensification towards that story of upheaval, of destruction, and then rebuilding that is occurring during this time. So kind of keep an eye out for that if you've got, anything around like 0 to 4-ish degrees of Aquarius, Scorpio, Taurus, and Leo, because that is definitely going to be an important one. Now, on October 20th, we get that Mercury Mars conjunction that we talked about earlier, right? This is where words become weapons and conversations and communication can become a little bit more incendiary. Mars is a little bit more pokey, and Mercury Mars stuff can feel really pokey. It can be having difficult conversations with people, but oftentimes it can also be an eruption of saying something and being like, oh, I did not mean to say it in that way, right? It's a little bit more cutting. And because of that, just be a little bit intentional. Because like we talked about before, Mercury's coming back to Scorpio. So you're going to revisit some of these things that you've said and some of these dynamics that show up at this time. Now, this can really set the mind on fire. I find Mercury Mars conjunctions, like we talked about before, can be really supportive for kind of having like a fast paced mind, right? Making decisions really quickly. But it can also feel like periods where you are overthinking more, right? Because Mars is inflaming the mercurial mind. And that can feel like just kind of going over and over again in a loop. And because this is Scorpio, this is like stewing energy, right? This is not talking about it and getting it out, but it's kind of like that thing that you just can't get out of your head that feels, painful to revisit, emotionally disruptive, or a little bit more challenging. If you have a day chart, this is going to manifest more in that direction, right? That it's going to be a little bit more stressful, a little bit more anxiety inducing potentially, and a little bit more uncomfortable versus if you have a night chart, you're more likely to experience this in a way that Mars is giving you the ability to make those quick decisions, to move really fast, and to be very decisive in actions going forward. So always want to take sect into consideration with the malefics in particular, because Mars is going to be a lot more constructive for people with night charts and a little bit more challenging for people with day charts, of which I am one. So I'm not super looking forward to this conjunction, but we will, as always, get through it together. And one of the things I do think is nice about this conjunction is that it happens in Mercury's bounds of Scorpio. And so they kind of get this quality of mutual reception because this is Mars's sign, but it's Mercury's bounds, and they're both going to be conjoining there. So there is this kind of, you know, consideration for each other because they both have responsibility towards the other that makes it a little bit more productive, right? But Mercury Mars, as we said before, is a little bit more willing to play the bad guy role. This can be like learning about things that are a little bit more mischievous in nature, a little bit martial in nature, right? This would be like a great transit to go like do EMT training under, or, learn about fire, or, something that is connected to the realm of Mars, to do kind of like investigations into taboo things. I find that bound of Scorpio to be one that is very concerned with the occult. So this can be great for any type of like esoteric deep dives, for learning about something and going really deep with hidden knowledge of some form. So that can be one of the more, positive ways that this plays out. And it can also just help cut through the noise. Mars likes to sever, and Mars can kind of help Mercury take things away that don't necessarily need to occupy as much of our mental space. But again, very sect dependent. So, keep that in mind. Now, on October 21st, we get a new moon in Libra at 28 degrees. And again, like kind of similarly to what we were talking about with the last full moon, I'm like, it's kind of boring and I'm kind of happy about it. I'm going to bring it up to show you guys what's going on here. Now, it does happen at the same time that we see that Mercury Mars conjunction still, occupying the same degree. So there is a little bit of something going on in the background, right? That's a little bit more divisive. That's a little bit more conflict oriented. But this new moon is averse to this. So there might be something happening in another area of your life, in the Scorpio part of your chart, that is a little bit more intense, right? Especially because Mercury is also aspecting Saturn. Luckily, Jupiter comes in and kind of prevents that from being a besiegement or something that's too challenging. But there is still kind of this Mercury Mars thing bubbling in the background. But in Libra, this is pretty sweet. It's averse to both malefic. So we don't have any kind of negative or harmful things happening to the sun and the moon at this time. It's co-present with Venus, who's ruling this lunation, right? This feels like a really kind of beautiful, fresh start in Libra. Again, this is not an eclipse, right? And we've been doing eclipses in Libra and Aries for a long time. And this feels like the dust has settled with whatever emerged during that eclipse cycle. And now we can kind of start fresh and feel like there is a rejuvenation in the Libra part of our chart that I think is just going to feel pleasant, honestly. Jupiter is squaring this, but Jupiter's in the overcoming position, right? Which means that Jupiter is kind of really encouraging both the sun and the moon at this time and helping them feel a lot more positive, a lot more supported. And all in all, like, I really like this lunation. I think it's going to feel really nice. It's like things have balanced out in this part of the chart. We don't have Saturn opposing it. It feels good, genuinely. And this final decan of Libra, where this new moon takes place, is one that has kind of a relationship to opposites and to polarities, right? If you think about the tarot card that is associated with this part of the zodiac, it is the Four of Swords. And that has like this saint sleeping, maybe praying, maybe laying down like this. And it is associated with rest, But then you also have this beautiful stained glass mirror window in the background that is very lively, right? And that is kind of pulled into this decan. There is like a rest and a liveliness that comes here, and kind of a going back and forth between those things. A lot of the decanic images talk about people partying, and having like a great time. And then you have like this rest orientation. So, you might feel pulled in one direction or another. One of my favorite things that I've ever read about this decan comes from Austin Coppock. And he says it's kind of like being the meditation in the center of a party, right? So there's a lot of chaos going on around you, but you're able to maintain this inner solitude, this inner quietude, this inner stillness, because you've lived both sides of the spectrum, right? You've gone back and forth a lot. And so, this new moon, it might bring you both, right? Where you go out and you have a really beautiful day with friends and you do brunch and you're hanging out and you walk a lot. And then you come home and you're like, okay, now I just want to have a nice, quiet night to relax and recharge. This is also a Tuesday though. So, maybe not so much the brunch thing, but go out and have a work day that feels, a little bit easier, a little bit smoother than usual. Come home and be able to, connect with a partner, connect with friends, and, rest in a way that is also really supportive. So kind of keep that in mind as we move through this eclipse, that there can be kind of a pull towards different opposing ends of a spectrum that come up with this. But usually it's like parties and good times, and it takes place in the bounds of Mars, which is a lot more commanding and leadership oriented. So there can be new opportunities in the Libra part of your chart for you to take on responsibility. And we think of Mars in Libra usually not in the best light, because Mars doesn't tend to fare so well in Libra. But if you actually read like what BDS Valens, a second century astrologer, wrote about this bound, it is so positive in a way that you're like, wait, what? But it is almost like this diplomatic kind of energy, someone who is capable of being in charge, but doesn't do it in this really aggressive fashion. And so opportunities for leadership might arise as well, especially if you have Libra in the 10th house, let's say, with such a benefic influence between Venus really supporting these planets and Jupiter overcoming them. All in all, I'm a fan. I like her. Just try to strike a balance and don't overdo it at this time. Now, on the 22nd, Neptune is going to re-enter Pisces. So we are done with Neptune and Aries for a little bit, for the rest of the year at least. And this is going to bring us back into the story of Pisces in a major way, right? Because now Saturn and Neptune have re-entered that sign. And this can bring a couple things to the forefront, because one, this is going to reactivate their conjunction. Even though they were still only a few degrees away, they had that sign boundary that was kind of keeping them focused on different things. Now we get back into this almost what is real, what is fake, what is distorted, what is clear, what is rigid, what is flexible, that comes up with Saturn and Neptune, right? Saturn is going to really focus on trying to build something solid, right? Saturn came back into Pisces because we weren't done here yet. We thought we had built a really solid foundation, but there's more work that we need to do here to really emerge from the Saturn and Pisces transit feeling like, okay, what we've created can last the next 30 years. And Neptune kind of makes that a little bit more challenging, because it brings up that fog element that we were talking about before, that can overshadow some of Saturn's desire for clarity and for sturdiness and for tangibility in the Pisces part of our charts, right? And so think about what house this occupies for you, because it's going to have very different significations, and kind of anticipate that there's going to be a little bit more of a confusion re-entering that area of life, where it might have felt like for the past September 1st to what is this, October 22nd, you got a little bit of a break, right? Where it was just Saturn, and it was like, okay, I know what I need to do here, right? I know what structures I need to put in place. I know what boundaries I need to set. I know how to kind of create a little bit more coherence in this area of my life. And then Neptune re-enters, and it's like, wait, do I though? Am I clear? Am I sure? Is this the right path? And we just kind of have to accept that confusion is part of this transit. It is part of the process of creating solid foundations in Pisces, right? Is a little bit of not knowing and learning to trust that we can't always have the utmost clarity when we are constructing something, right? Sometimes you don't know what the finished product is going to be. That doesn't mean you should just stop what you're doing and not take any steps forward. And I think that's a big part of this Saturn and Neptune co-presence in Pisces, on top of the fact that wherever Neptune is, we kind of start glamorizing and idealizing whatever archetype is associated with that sign. And so with Pisces, it's the sage, it's the mystic, right? It's the empath. And this is very different than the idealization of the warrior, of the figure that is a little bit more rebellious or divisive, right? If you think about what's been going on in the world and the types of people that have been pedestaled in recent times, um, you know, that's Neptune and Aries. That's the idealization and the glamorization of the Aries figure, right? People who just say it like it is, right? Maybe not always the best. Maybe we don't need to be idealizing individualism even more. Maybe we don't need to be idealizing violence. Maybe we don't need to be idealizing figures who are proponents of violence. Just my take. And so I'm kind of excited to see that shift back towards, idealizing a little bit more of like an empathetic perspective. I think that we could all use a dose of that right now. But we might see another kind of focus on astrology. Neptune through Pisces was a big, big catalyst for astrology getting a lot more popular. Everyone having co-star on their phones, right? Knowing your big three, all of this kind of came out of this Neptune and Pisces transit, along with social media and the dissolving of boundaries, right? That we see in our relationships with other people. All of a sudden, we have this expectation that we should have access to everyone all of the time, right? That mutability of Pisces and the water element, where boundaries are already a little bit slippery. It's a water sign, right? So this deals with our emotions and our relationships. And now we have Neptune coming back in. That can also bring some difficulties around, let's say, social media, around having access to people, around projection, celebrity culture, all of those things. But in our personal lives, it's probably just going to manifest as like a heavy dose of confusion in the Pisces part of your chart again. Like, you thought you figured it out. Well, you didn't, and that's just going to be a little bit different. And now, at this time, we are really moving away from an air and fire concentration in the sky towards a water concentration in the sky, right? We're going to have Mars and Mercury in Scorpio, Saturn in Pisces, Neptune in Pisces, and Jupiter in Cancer. So there is a huge, huge focus on all of these different water signs in your chart. So think about what grand trine that occupies for you, right? If this is like the second, sixth, 10th houses, if this is the first, fifth, ninth, right? Because you're really going to be pulled towards that. And in some ways, there might be an ability to find harmony within that because all of these planets are going to be communicating with one another really well. But it's also just going to bring kind of an overwhelm of water energy. So, tap into your emotions, listen to your intuition, follow that voice in your head, right? Do some dream work, like allow yourself to feel a little bit more go with the flow. It's a little bit more of a passive, receptive orientation. Not that receptivity has to be passive, but it can be. And that's very different from the really strong fire and air focus, which is a lot more external. It's diurnal. It's like, let's go out into the world and make something and do something and take action. This is a little bit more like, let's reflect. Let's think about things. Let's feel into this a little bit more. How do I feel about this? How do I change that if I don't feel good about it? Right? That's a little bit more of the water kind of perspective. And so that's what we're going to be doing for a while here. So kind of be prepared to lean into the crying and the nostalgia and the reflectiveness, because I think that there's ways in which it can be really supportive, right? To reconnect with our emotionality, to reconnect with the side of ourself that is not necessarily as concerned with progress. Air and fire signs are diurnal in nature. They're of the sun, right? So we are very focused on the ideal, on consistency, on progress, and on doing something that other people can see, point at, and be like, they achieved that. And water signs are of the moon, right? They are nocturnal. We don't necessarily have that. They're more connective. They're more focused on what occurs under the cover of night, right? Those kind of joys and pleasures that maybe don't necessarily feel as obvious or visible in the external world, but that often bring greater emotional fulfillment. So, lots of water stuff going on over here. And that only gets kicked up to another level when the sun enters Scorpio on October 23rd, the very next day. So now we have Sun, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune all in water signs. It's like we're in an ocean over here. It is going to be very watery. Um, so Sun enters Scorpio, right? It's like secrecy is cool, actually, right? Scorpio loves that kind of secret, mysterious vibe. And this looks like, focusing a little bit more on that part of your chart, but also being a little bit less loud and proud and vocal around what you're doing and a little bit more mysterious and undercover with it. Scorpio as a sign is one that is very concerned with trust as a concept, right? And with the sun and Mercury and Mars all moving through here, there can be some kind of tension points that get brought up around relationships and trust being betrayed with Mars and Mercury, and then having to have hard conversations around that, but that being brought to light with the sun's entry into this sign. It also just means we're going to have a stellium of planets moving through Scorpio. So whatever house that is for you, you can expect a really big uptick in those themes. If this is like your sixth house, it might be focusing a lot more on work or on health. For me, this is my sixth house, and I know that like right around this time, I'm going to be joining a gym. Work stuff is going to be picking up. There's going to be that kind of orientation. Seventh house can be really focusing on relationships, conflict within relationships. Eighth house can be long-term financial planning, your relationship to mortality, facing your fears. Ninth house can be going really deep into a field of study, considering what you believe in, traveling. 10th house can be your career, making really big changes in your life, right? Stepping onto a bit more of a public or visible stage and having to battle the desire to not be seen or not want to be seen as you do so. 11th house can be around friendships and community, and the ways in which you are really trying to funnel energy into building your dreams and achieving them. And the 11th house is a very ambitious part of the chart, right? Can also be a focus on advocacy and activism. 12th house can be a little bit more of a big focus on your internal world, on a desire for solitude and rest, and kind of taking time away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, in particular to do work that is a little bit more focused on the psyche, on your mental health, right? First house can be health oriented as well, redefining your self concept. For you guys, Scorpio risings, this is probably going to feel pretty nice because you've got Mars in domicile for the first time in a while. And you've also got Mercury and the sun there kind of bringing a spotlight onto you. Second house can be figuring out ways to resource yourself and support yourself financially and otherwise, focusing on how whatever you feed yourself, literally, as in the food that you feed yourself, but the content you consume as well, how that impacts you, how it feels, right? And maybe cutting some things out in a way in order to feel better. Third house can be a little bit more of a intense focus around your siblings, potentially having a lot more of a busy pace. Third house is the house of transportation, right? So you tend to just be on the go. It's your everyday environment, it's your neighborhood. You're just like out and about. You're just doing things a lot. Fourth house can be a little bit more of a focus on your family, on your living situation. This can be moving. This can also just be redecorating, fixing things up around the house, right? Renovating, all of that stuff. And fifth house is a little bit more of an intense focus on children, creativity, pleasure, pouring a lot of energy into things that bring you joy and running into some potential tension points with Mars there as well. Okay. Now the sun is supported by Mars in the stellium, but we're also just, it's going to bring that kind of illumination property to the Scorpio parts of our chart. So things that we didn't necessarily have the same amount of clarity around, we're going to be developing a lot more of an ability to have sight into that part of the chart. So things coming to light in the Scorpio area of your life is definitely something to expect. The sun is also going to square Pluto upon entry, just like Mercury did. So you can kind of expect, power imbalances, certain things being brought to light, potentially, some news about corruption, and having that come and having that solar property of illumination onto those Plutonian things, which are usually a little bit more beneath the earth, a little bit more hidden, and sometimes dealing or oftentimes dealing with the concept of power and abuses of power. Finally, we are going to have Mercury entering Sagittarius on October 29th. This is fun. This is nice. I think it's going to bring a little bit more of a lighthearted energy into things. Scorpio, for all of its many, many wonderful qualities, is not super lighthearted. Right? There's an intensity, kind of like this probing quality to Scorpio. And in Sagittarius, especially this first decan of Sagittarius that Mercury co-rules, it's a little bit more of like a silly Billy, clown college, do it for the joke, do it for the plot, do it for meaning, kind of energy. And so I think that this is going to feel like a big change of pace, even though it is Mercury entering the sign of their detriment, which can make some of the mercurial parts of our lives, right? The Virgo and Gemini houses are going to start, having to go through a process of being reworked and revisited, as they are every time Mercury prepares to station retrograde. It's going to station, right within those first few degrees, around 5-6 degrees. So we're well in the shadow period now. So be mindful that, it's coming. You're going to be revisiting. Mercury's going to go back over these same degrees, and that some of what happens from October 29th onwards is going to be, showing up for a while. Again, we don't get away from this stuff. Mercury's really slowing down. This can bring, a slowdown of commerce, of transportation, of all of those mercurial things. If you've got to sign anything at this time, read twice, cross your T's, dot your I's, double check everything. That is kind of the best thing that you can do whenever Mercury is not doing so hot in the sky. But that first decan of Sagittarius, it's one that's really focused on myth, on meaning, and on magic. And so there is kind of this quality of going out and seeking that we find there. And it is a faster paced decan, even though Mercury is slowing down. So you might run into a desire to be moving really quickly, and then certain things might show up that kind of force you to slow down. So a little bit of like a whiplash sort of thing there happening as well. And then that's really going to be kind of like the big stuff that shows up once Mercury does enter. They are going to oppose Uranus, which can bring some shakeups into Mercury's sphere, a desire for change, right? Uranus really likes to revolutionize what we are focusing on. And when Mercury aspects Uranus, it can feel like flashes of insight, but oppositions tend to be a little bit tenser. So it can feel like, wow, I really want to change this thing, and I can't necessarily make it happen quite yet. I think I might just combust because I want to have this change and it's just not occurring in the way that I want it to. So be ready for a little bit of mental frustration with that Uranus opposition, right? The desire to change what you're thinking, what you're learning, and maybe not being able to quite yet, as we will see play out throughout the rest of the retrograde cycle. But that really brings us to the end of the month. And so even though we've got a lot going on, as we always do, because the planets are always moving, there are some real bright spots that we see this month. And all in all, I do think it is a much calmer energy than we've been seeing with, eclipse season and in August. So I hope that it treats you well. I hope that you have a beautiful month. If you enjoyed this forecast, don't forget to leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you are watching the video version, make sure you like this video, subscribe, tell a friend, help the podcast grow. And it would be a, that's not articulate. I was going to say I would really appreciate it. So we're going to leave it there. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of Threads of Fate, and I will catch you in the next one.